Autumn, 1700. In the dimly lit chambers of the Royal Alcazar in Madrid, the most powerful empire on earth was watching its king die. But this was no ordinary death. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Habsburg rulers, had become something that shocked even the hardened courtiers who served him daily. His body had failed so completely, so grotesquely, that those who entered his chambers often left pale and trembling. Here was a man who commanded an empire stretching across continents, yet could barely lift his own head from his pillow. His story is not simply one of personal tragedy. His death would shatter the fragile peace of Europe and ignite a continent-wide war lasting over a decade. Charles II stands as history's most devastating example of what happens when political ambition corrupts the very bloodline it seeks to protect. They were, in reality, slowly poisoning it. The Spanish Habsburgs were, for nearly 2 centuries, the most powerful ruling family in human history. At their peak, they controlled an empire stretching from the Americas to the Philippines, from the Netherlands to the Italian peninsula. Silver from Peruvian mines funded their armies, while Spanish galleons dominated every ocean. Their power seemed almost supernatural in its reach. But sustaining this empire required more than military might. The Habsburgs believed their greatest weapon was strategic marriage. By marrying within their own family, they could prevent their vast territories from being divided or absorbed by rival dynasties. Uncles married nieces, first cousins exchanged vows. Charles II entered the world in 1661, not merely as a prince, but as the living consequence of centuries of calculated inbreeding. His parents, King Philip IV and Queen Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. His grandparents were first cousins. Going further back, the pattern only deepened, generation after generation of Habsburgs marrying within their own bloodline, convinced that keeping power within the family meant keeping blood within the family too. Modern geneticists who later analyzed Charles's ancestry calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.25, a figure that exceeded what would typically result from a child born to full biological siblings. This was not an accident of fate or a cruel twist of nature. It was the mathematically inevitable outcome of deliberate dynastic policy. His severe physical and mental disabilities were not just likely from the moment of his conception. They were virtually guaranteed. From the moment of his birth, it was clear something was deeply wrong. Charles could not walk until he was 8 years old, an alarming delay that courtiers struggled to explain away. His tongue was so enlarged it made speech nearly impossible, causing him to drool constantly and rendering most of his words incomprehensible. The infamous Habsburg jaw, inherited through generations of intermarriage, was so severely pronounced in Charles that his upper and lower teeth never once met, making chewing solid food an agonizing ordeal. Seizures struck him without warning throughout his childhood, leaving him trembling and helpless on palace floors. His mental capacity remained severely limited, preventing him from receiving even basic education. Yet despite these devastating and visible disabilities, when his father Philip IV died in 1665, the 4-year-old Charles was crowned King of Spain. Who would inherit when Charles finally died? Foreign ambassadors filed meticulous reports home, their dispatches dripping with barely concealed anticipation. Neighboring powers were circling like wolves, sensing a wounded animal, and Spain's courtiers knew it. 2 figures dominated European political calculations throughout Charles's reign. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King at the height of his power, watched Madrid with calculating patience. Across the empire, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I maintained his own careful vigil. Both men had legitimate dynastic claims to the Spanish throne through their Habsburg bloodlines. The question of Spanish succession became the most pressing diplomatic crisis in Europe. Controlling Spain meant controlling vast territories spanning 4 continents. Charles's court understood that without an heir, everything the Habsburgs had built would collapse. In 1679, they arranged his marriage to Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of Louis XIV himself. The match was politically calculated, but personally tragic. Marie-Louise, by most accounts a vibrant and intelligent young woman, found herself trapped in a suffocating court alongside a husband whose disabilities made normal marital life nearly impossible. Despite 9 years of marriage, she produced no children. When she died suddenly in 1689 under circumstances that sparked immediate whispers of poisoning, the court barely paused to mourn before arranging Charles's second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg. This union proved equally barren. By 1700, with Charles visibly deteriorating and both marriages having failed completely, the Spanish court existed in a state of barely controlled panic, while France and Austria quietly sharpened their ambitions. By autumn of 1700, Charles's condition had become almost incomprehensible to witness. Courtiers who had served him for decades were visibly shaken by how rapidly his body was surrendering. He could no longer walk without 2 attendants physically supporting his weight, his legs having lost the strength to carry even his frail frame. The infamous Habsburg jaw, already grotesquely pronounced since birth, had worsened to the point where his mouth could never fully close, causing constant uncontrollable drooling that soaked through cloth after cloth. Swallowing had become agonizing, meaning every meal was a prolonged ordeal. The Venetian ambassador, in dispatches sent back to Venice, described encountering a figure of almost supernatural horror, skin turned waxy and translucent, eyes bulging outward from sunken sockets, resembling less a living monarch and more a breathing corpse already halfway claimed by death, masking what many quietly described as the unmistakable scent of a man already dying from within. Courtiers reported hours of blank staring, his eyes fixed on nothing, followed suddenly by fits of screaming or uncontrollable laughter that echoed through the palace corridors. He held lengthy conversations with invisible companions, gesturing and responding to voices only he could hear. Shadowy figures haunted his chambers, sending him into terrified fits that left attendants shaken and helpless. His digestive system had essentially stopped functioning, leaving him in constant agony. Chronic insomnia tormented him nightly, his screams piercing the darkness and disturbing the entire court. Perhaps most distressing for those attending him was the overwhelming smell of decay emanating from his deteriorating body, so powerful that courtiers were forced to drench themselves in perfume before entering his presence. Something beyond natural explanation, they quietly concluded, must be responsible for Charles's impossible suffering. Charles would collapse without warning, his body convulsing violently across stone floors, eyes rolling completely back into his skull, foam pouring freely from his mouth as courtiers stood frozen in helpless horror. Each episode lasted longer than the last, and recovery stretched from hours into full days of complete unconsciousness. Royal physicians had tried everything within their considerable knowledge. Bloodletting drained him repeatedly until he barely had strength to lift his head. Purging treatments left him retching for hours. Herbal remedies, mineral compounds, and elaborate medicinal preparations all proved utterly useless against whatever was destroying their king from within. As conventional medicine collapsed under the weight of its own failures, the Spanish court made a fateful turn toward the supernatural. Theologians and priests gathered in urgent council, reviewing Charles's symptoms with growing certainty. The convulsions, the visions, the incomprehensible speech, the overwhelming smell of decay, all were catalogued against ancient religious texts describing demonic possession. Their conclusion was unanimous and chilling. Charles II was not merely sick, he was possessed. Father Antonio Maricella, the court's chief exorcist, produced a formal written document meticulously listing what he identified as classical signs of diabolical infestation. The involuntary movements, the conversations with invisible presences, the apparent immunity to conventional treatment, each observation reinforced his diagnosis. Father Maricella recommended immediate and intensive exorcism procedures, effectively signing the death warrant of rational medical treatment. 3 centuries of Habsburg power had finally surrendered to superstition, his breathing so faint that attendants pressed mirrors to his lips, searching desperately for any sign of life, where attendants bound him to his bed with thick linen restraints. Father Maricella led a procession of black-robed priests who filled the room with incense smoke and the rhythmic drone of Latin prayers that lasted for hours without pause. What began as private religious ceremony rapidly transformed into something far more disturbing. The Spanish nobility received formal invitations to witness these sessions, as though Charles's suffering had become royal entertainment. What they witnessed defied explanation. Charles screamed in voices that seemed entirely unlike his own, sometimes simultaneously. Among the most chilling first-hand accounts of Charles's final months came from the Marquis de Louville, an unofficial French observer embedded within the Spanish court. His secret dispatches to Versailles painted a portrait so disturbing that Louis XIV reportedly read them in complete silence. Louville described Charles's speech as utterly incomprehensible, a grotesque mixture of fragmented syllables and guttural sounds, bearing no resemblance to any recognizable language. His accounts of the exorcism sessions were equally harrowing, describing priests working in desperate relays while Charles convulsed violently beneath their hands. Most haunting was Louville's description of the aftermath. He wrote that once the priests ceased their ministrations, Charles lay completely motionless, resembling nothing so much as a freshly prepared corpse. His breathing became so imperceptibly shallow that multiple witnesses pressed their ears directly against his chest, genuinely uncertain whether their king still lived. While eyewitness accounts painted a vivid picture, the written records left behind offer an even more devastating portrait of Charles's final months. Dr. Miguel Fernandez, the king's personal physician, maintained meticulous clinical records documenting every stage of his patient's deterioration. His notes describe complete systemic failure, cataloguing collapsed digestion, wasting muscles, and a mind retreating entirely from reality. But perhaps most striking is Fernandez's growing anguish regarding the exorcism sessions themselves, his entries become increasingly desperate, noting that each session left Charles physically weaker than before, his pulse thinner, his breathing shallower. Fernandez wrote plainly that the priests were accelerating death rather than preventing it. Meanwhile, Queen Maria Anna's private letters to her sister reveal an equally unbearable reality. She described the overwhelming smell of decay permeating the royal chambers, Charles's nightly screaming echoing through stone corridors, and the crushing political pressure demanding she somehow produce a miracle nobody could deliver. The dying king, stripped of dignity and agency, had become merely an instrument through which Europe's most powerful forces fought their desperate political war. Bedridden and resembling a living skeleton, his translucent skin stretched across protruding bones, while courtiers whispered in hushed, desperate tones beyond his chamber doors. The Spanish court had transformed into a battlefield of competing ambitions, with supporters of Archduke Charles of Austria and Philip of Anjou circling like vultures. Each faction took calculated turns entering the royal bedchamber, leaning close to the barely conscious king, desperately attempting to extract declarations favorable to their candidate. Palace scribes hovered nearby, gently guiding his trembling, weakened hand across succession documents of enormous consequence. Sometimes Charles would murmur incoherently, and both factions would immediately claim his words supported their position. November 1st, 1700 began with an unsettling quiet. The violent seizures that had tormented Charles for months had ceased entirely, replaced by an almost serene stillness that rippled through the palace corridors. Courtiers whispered cautiously to one another that perhaps the exorcisms had finally worked, that God had heard their desperate prayers and driven the darkness from their king. The physicians said nothing, recognizing the stillness for what it truly was. Around midday, Charles stirred unexpectedly. His eyes opened briefly, and those gathered around his bedside leaned forward as his cracked lips moved, attempting to form words that never fully materialized. Then he slipped away again, beyond reach. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, his already shallow breathing simply stopped. No dramatic final moment, no last declaration. Europe's most powerful throne had just become vacant, and the continent would never be the same. His body had been surrendering long before his final breath. What they documented would shock even the most experienced medical minds of the era. His heart was no larger than a child's fist, shriveled and barely capable of sustaining circulation. His lungs were filled with fluid and had partially rotted away. His brain, catastrophically small and visibly damaged, resembled that of a young child rather than a 39-year-old man. His digestive system had essentially ceased functioning entirely. Most disturbing of all was what the physicians could not explain. Several organs displayed advanced decomposition, decay that medical understanding of the time associated exclusively with death. Parts of Charles's body had literally begun rotting while he was still breathing, still conscious, still enduring those endless exorcism sessions. Charles's death on November 1st, 1700, detonated a political explosion that had been building for decades. France immediately championed Philip of Anjou's claim, citing a will Charles had allegedly signed in his final weeks. Austria countered by declaring Archduke Charles the rightful king, refusing to accept French dominance over Spain's vast empire. England and the Dutch Republic, deeply alarmed by the prospect of France controlling territories stretching from Madrid to Manila, aligned with Austria, forming the Grand Alliance. What followed became the most devastating European conflict since the 30 Years' War, consuming an entire continent for over a decade. Meanwhile, the Spanish Empire itself began fracturing almost immediately. Regional governors across Italy, the Americas, and the Low Countries began maneuvering independently, sensing that central authority had collapsed entirely alongside their broken king. Now serve as historical reference points for researchers studying inherited genetic disorders across generations. Scientists studying Habsburg genealogical records calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.25, equivalent to a child born to full biological siblings. Every generation of strategic marriage had compounded the damage, creating a genetic bottleneck so severe that producing a healthy heir had become biologically near impossible long before Charles was even conceived. His family had essentially engineered their own extinction through calculated political marriages spanning nearly 2 centuries. Perhaps most remarkably, Charles's autopsy conducted in 1600 represents one of the earliest detailed medical examinations documenting severe inbreeding effects on the human body. Physicians recorded conditions that medicine would not fully understand until 20th century genetics emerged. His documented symptoms, including hormonal deficiencies, organ malformation, and immune dysfunction, the grotesque spectacle of Charles's final months sent shockwaves far beyond the Spanish court. Enlightenment thinkers across Europe seized upon the public exorcisms as devastating evidence against religious dogma controlling governance. Philosophers like Voltaire pointed directly to Spain's humiliation as proof that superstition had no place in modern statecraft. Here was Europe's most powerful Catholic monarchy, commanding vast empires stretching across multiple continents, reduced to restraining their dying king while priests screamed Latin prayers over his convulsing body. The image was impossible to defend. Critics of traditional authority used these accounts relentlessly, arguing that rational governance demanded separation from religious interference. The Spanish court's complete abandonment of medical reasoning in favor of demonic explanations became a cautionary tale repeated in pamphlets circulating from Paris to London. Charles's suffering, already profound, inadvertently accelerated the intellectual revolution that would permanently reshape Western civilization's relationship with both religion and political power. Charles II's story ultimately transcends its 17th century setting, speaking directly to timeless questions about power, dignity, and human responsibility. His suffering was not accidental. It was engineered across generations by rulers who treated human beings as political instruments, sacrificing biological reality on the altar of dynastic ambition. Every seizure, every exorcism session, every moment of incomprehensible agony represented the accumulated cost of decisions made long before his birth. The sophisticated court that surrounded him possessed the resources to offer genuine, compassionate care, yet chose spectacle and political maneuvering instead. His dying body became a battlefield for competing ambitions rather than a human being deserving mercy. His legacy reminds us that unchecked power inevitably consumes itself, that science ignored produces suffering, and that political ambition divorced from compassion creates monsters from the very systems designed to protect human dignity. Charles deserved better, so does every generation that inherits power's consequences.